what our standpoints should be and how that has to be pitted against other developed countries. And before that, I'll just give a short introduction about who we are and why we are doing these lectures. This lecture particularly is jointly organized by Tamil Nadu Science Forum and the Indian School of Social Sciences, TNSF and ISSS. And because the topic is such that it is both a science topic as well as a social science topic, we have jointly organized this lecture. Tamil Nadu Science Forum, its main motto is to ensure scientific temperament, to take science to the people, science to the masses, science for everyone. That's how it started. And it works on various fronts, from working against superstitions to working towards inclusive education. It works in a lot of science publication for children and taking that to children through small science clubs in neighborhoods. It was also leading in the literacy movement in Tamil Nadu in the 1980s. I feel like the Tamil Nadu Science Forum has plays a crucial role in Tamil Nadu, and it is part of the All India Science Network, AIPSN. On the other hand, the Indian School of Social Sciences was started by a small group of intellectuals based in Chennai in the 1980s. And it has predominantly worked in the academic sphere only, studying, researching, discussing, holding lectures. That has been the nature of the Indian School of Social Sciences. If any of you are interested to be working with ISSS, to be organizing these lectures, to be working with Tamil Nadu Science Forum, do approach us after the lecture. And if you want to get emails regarding these lectures, you can scan and register. In case you want certificates also, you can register. You can scan and register and you'll get certificates specifically. Okay, I'll pass on the mic to Mr. Gautam, who is a research fellow at the MSSRF Foundation in Chennai, and he'll be moderating today's lecture. Thanks.
Thank you, sir.
For the live stream.
Good evening, everyone. First off, thank you to Tamil Nadu Science Forum and Indian School of Social Sciences for organizing this very timely and an important discussion, because there's been a lot of discussion, particularly immediately following the COPs and everything, of what it means and how do we go from here. There's a lot of media attention around it. But I think the point of the lecture here would be first, of course, to discuss the key aspects, the key negotiation points, or what the outcomes are of this particular COP. But like any COP, and particularly this COP, any discussion around it is not complete unless we frame it in the larger context of the global climate regime, especially because the outcomes and how to make sense of it doesn't fall into place unless we place it in historical context of how the negotiations have proceeded over the last couple of decades, in fact 3 decades, and how it sort of implies for the global north, which is the developed countries versus the developing country, the schism which has always existed in the global climate regime, but of late which has been particularly being exacerbated over time. I think the lecture will also look at what this means for the global multilateral climate action of the kind that we see today, and also what are the implications of it, when it comes to, especially when it comes to the developing countries, and how does it directly affect us, what is our stake in it, and also how do we go from here, what are the challenges in front of us, and how does it immediately affect our policy, and other questions around it. So without further ado, I'll pass it on to Professor Jayaraman. And I don't think there is anybody better qualified at the present moment to discuss this more than him, because he's been part of the negotiations for the last 4 to 5 years. And even before that, he's been at the thick of climate policy discussions and several committees and several delegations, both to IPCC as well as UNFCCC. So without any further ado, KJ, you have the stage.
Yeah. So, uh, thank you very much to the Anna Centenary Library, the Tamil Nadu Science Forum, and the Indian School of Social Sciences for organizing this lecture and rather a presentation, after which perhaps we can have some discussion. Now, I am particularly grateful because I have not come so frequently to the Anna Centenary Library, but it is one of the most, eminent amenities, public amenities in the city of Chennai, and I think we should be proud that we have such a library, and I hope in future the library will expand and continue to provide services, even though the written word is not as popular as the digital screen in these days. But I hope this library will continue to be successful and a home to students and scholars over the years. Tamil Nadu Science Forum and Indian School of Social Sciences in Chennai are both organizations with which I have had a long association going back to my days as a college student in Chennai. Some of us here have been very active. This was a forum where we both we taught each other many things about both from the realm of the social sciences, the world around us, and also about the natural sciences and technology. So it's very I'm delighted that there is a new generation of activists who are taking up this task, and to the extent that is possible, we will continue to work with them. So all the best also for the future to the Science Forum and the Indian School of Social Sciences. Having said this, let me get to the subject of the talk, which is about COP29. So COP29, COP stands for Conference of Parties. So the United Nations Framework Convention on climate change. Uh, yes, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change is the name of the treaty, but the first treaty on climate change. It does not provide details too much of what to do, but it provides the framework under which the climate action in the world should take place, namely, how do we meet the challenge of global warming? Okay, so this is the UNFCCC. The words UNFCCC are used not only for the actual treaty, but the organization that continues to work on the implementation of the treaty. So it is also an organization. So every year, the highest body of the UNFCCC is the Conference of Parties. Parties are those who have signed the treaty, which now is almost 100% of all countries on earth, so in the world. So at the Conference of Parties, this is the 29th in the series. There was 1 year gap after 1992 when this was signed, and that then there was one break here because of COVID. So that is why we have come to COP29, even though the UNFCCC itself was signed in 1992 at the Rio Earth Summit. So there is a nice word from political science which I think we should learn to appreciate. It is called, you talk of a regime. So when we talk of a global climate regime, what is meant is there is not as if there is a single law. It is not as if it is simply like domestic. We don't have a law. So there is no international climate law as such. There are treaties, there are rules of procedure, there are ways we even in which we interpret these rules and we carry out various activities. This entire set of all these things is what is referred to as a global climate regime. So whatever happens, whether organized, official, multilateral, meaning including all nations under the aegis of the UN, and so on and so forth, all of this constitutes the climate regime. So the UNFCCC has provided the first steps, and then this was further developed by the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement into the totality of, and it's all its decisions, etc., the totality of which we call the climate regime. So there is some basic features of this which we must appreciate. Otherwise, what happens in COP29 or any other COP, whether it was Glasgow or Dubai or whatever, seems like a lot of mumbo jumbo, otherwise just a lot of words. And many people, as a result, think that this does not have very much to do with what we are doing or what we need to do, which is also not very correct. So so the UNFCCC is a series of things, articles, which spell out basically the basic principles and values under which we would undertake climate action. It has a preamble introducing the problem, why we are concerned about global warming, why we should take action, how did it happen? Very briefly, there are indications, and the basic principles on which we should undertake climate action. And these basic principles are very important to appreciate. The first is, it says to undertake climate action on the basis of equity, and from the context, it is clear that it is equity between countries and also within countries. So, on the basis of equity and the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. So, if you are a activist, or if you are a government person in climate, or you are one of these climate NGOs, you can always hear people saying CPDR and RC. So, outsiders might wonder what this acronym is. So, it's very important. Common but differentiated responsibilities. This is actually an excellent sort of phrase. Is one of the times when the world succeeded in actually giving ourselves useful and important principle. Common because global warming affects all. And in some way, minor or major, all of us do contribute to global warming. It's a consequence of modern human, and even little bit going back even in earlier times, all human economic activity and consequent social and other activities, all of them have something to do with global warming. They release greenhouse gas emissions, which then lead to warming of the planet. So climate change is too neutral a word. A better word is global warming of human origin. So it is a common responsibility, but it is very important. And, people talk of India's contributions in the international politics, etc. One of the real contributions of India, because we played a big role, is in formulating this principle. So these responsibilities are also differentiated. Not everybody bears equal responsibility. So this is a very extremely important part of the principle, common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. So you may be responsible, but by the fact of your personal circumstances, the way your country is situated, and the way your country fits what is its past history, your responsibility may not be on par with your ability to deal with it. Or some of you may have greater capability of dealing with it, even though your responsibility may not be maximal or the most major. So, respective capabilities, and very clearly recognizing the inequalities in the world, it talks very clearly of how developed countries have to take the lead. And this is part of the basic principle, acknowledging two things. One, that they have contributed the most to global warming disproportionately, and the other, that they also have, partly as a consequence, the ability, the maximal ability to deal with this problem. Okay, so these are very important. Alongside, it is not simply as a principle, but the developed countries in signing the treaty, and you will be surprised to know the United States was one of the first countries to sign this, to ratify this treaty. Sorry. The spring. சரி பரவாயில்ல நான் மேனேஜ் பண்ணிடுறேன். So, uh, so this is not only a principle, but the principle is agreed to by the developed countries because they have made a commitment. In the UNFCC, it talks about commitments and by developed countries to take the lead in both mitigation, which is reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and adaptation, because having already emitted greenhouse gases, we have to deal with the consequences, to take the lead and, very importantly, provide the means of implementation, which is finance, climate finance as it is called, then technology transfer and capacity building. Okay, capacity building means helping people develop the capabilities, the skills, or and the systems, etc., to deal with these issues. So developing countries, recognizing their problems and the fact that they are on the path of development, developing countries have to undertake climate action, but with poverty eradication and sustainable development as their overriding priorities. Not simply priorities, not simply paying attention to, but as overriding priorities. However, this is, in my view, a brilliant document. Those of you who have not read it, I would encourage you to please go through it on your own. It's available on the net easily. But since its beginning, soon after, partly the developed countries could not persuade developing countries to sign such a treaty without all these conditions. Because developing countries, the natural answer at that time was, you are responsible, so please do something about it. And our responsibility is relatively so much less that this is, you have to do it. So obviously we wouldn't have signed such an agreement without such terms and conditions in it, so to speak, without all these principles. At the same time, they were also, I think, the realization of how much actually climate change would cost, meaning action to deal with climate change, what are the difficulties involved. All of this was also not clear. And in the period since then, the mood on this issue, especially in the developed countries, the political shift to the right has dictated their attitude. So essentially, their attitude always is India and China must also do their share. Now, their share meaning what? So it means forget the past, forget what all we were responsible for, but from now on, you also have to bear the burden. And this they apply to the entire world. So this is one part of it. The other part of it, it has to be done without disturbing our economic dominance. So they have a lot of conditions, etc. And they say you cannot do it through. And of course, 1992, when the treaty was signed, was roughly when the Soviet bloc also imploded. So at this point, of course, so they want everything through markets. It has to be done through free trade, no restrictions, no public sector, very little emphasis on public finance. So these two sets of ideas to impose on the rest of the world has become the agenda of the developed countries. And whether it is Trump or whether it is Obama or Biden, whether it is Starmer or whether it is Tony Blair or whether it is the conservatives like Cameron, etc., all of them are single-minded in pursuing these two elements of the agenda. And it applies to all developed countries to greater or lesser degree. So this story begins very early. One of the first agreements was the Kyoto Protocol. So the Kyoto Protocol had some mitigation commitments, emission reduction commitments by developed countries. It was very minimal, but at least it was a beginning. Developing countries had no specific burden. But one of the things that they sneaked into it, the United States in particular, through Al Gore, etc., is that you have to start trying to do it through carbon trading. We'll talk later about what is carbon trading, but through market means you have to deal with climate change. But then, of course, very quickly, Al Gore came back home. The US Senate almost unanimously, 98 to 2, passed a resolution saying, unless China and India have comparable burdens, we will not do anything. So the United States never ratified the Kyoto Protocol. So this was during the Clinton regime. And then immediately after Clinton came George Bush Jr. So, so it's basically this was the story. And this is the story then, thanks to the Japanese who started it, undermining the protocol which was signed in their own country. So in Bali in 2007, they began this idea of how to put restrictions on, how to get developing countries to do more. So many of us felt at that time, not 2007, but in 8, etc., that yes, perhaps in developing countries, we are not sufficiently paying attention to this issue. So broadly, there was some agreement about developing countries. Okay, yes, we should do more. So they started producing plans, etc., for mitigation. But the idea was that by COP15 in Copenhagen, we should have a long-term agreement about what to do about climate change. Copenhagen was a disaster because the developed countries wanted everything. All the developing countries to do as much almost as they were doing. So developing countries said nothing of the sort. There was a confrontation and all this drama happened about Obama meeting Manmohan Singh and other leaders from China, Brazil and South Africa in the middle of the night and, signing an agreement and then telling others, etc. So basically this Copenhagen agreement did the following. First, it set a temperature target of 2 degrees centigrade warming as the limit we will try to achieve. That was useful, important. Developed countries were to, however, implement their own emission reduction targets to which they will commit. And this is the beginning of the voluntary approach, which later the Paris Agreement has made the basic principle. So what happened? Then developing countries were to implement their national mitigation plans. Targets was not very clearly stated, but however, the thing began that this would be reviewed in a loose way, in not a very strict way, but nevertheless, we will start reviewing. So the idea is to turn the screw by, little by little, and developed countries, 17 years after the UNFCCC was signed. Finally, they set a target of climate finance which they would deliver, which is this famous 100 billion US dollars annually, which they will provide as climate finance to developing countries. So we'll come back to what climate finance exactly means in a little bit. But all this is a lot of excellent conversation. But these are treaties, there are discussions, various things are done. But what is actually happening in terms of emissions? So you see here the actual emissions reductions, actual emissions, not the reductions, of the developed countries, excluding Russia and Eastern Europe. And you see, actually, until 2005, their emissions were rising in spite of the treaty that they have signed. And only in 2005, particularly because of the United States, their emissions started going down. But even now, the extent to which it has gone down is minimal compared to 1992. So basically from 1992 to 2022, what have they done? Extremely little. Okay. Meanwhile, all the discussions, all the ideas, all the programs, all the schemes, all the proposals, all the negotiations are continuing, in which they take a great interest, are very active. Now, what is very important to appreciate is that it is not simply the annual emissions, which is the important criterion, but the cumulative emissions, which are part of are the important indicator. See, unlike methane, which is the best example, there are greenhouse gases which go into the atmosphere and then they are no longer retain the same character. So methane becomes a little bit of carbon dioxide and the rest of it is chemically becomes something else. So after a while, if you stop emitting methane, especially from natural sources, if you stop emitting methane or not stop even, if you start reducing the amount of methane you emit, then it does not contribute to warming. Carbon dioxide, on the other hand, stays in the atmosphere and it's part of the global carbon cycle. So the carbon that you emit, every molecule of carbon contributes to warming. And so you find roughly that there is a linear relationship, meaning direct proportionality between the amount of carbon dioxide which is emitted and the warming of the planet. We know what it is roughly. So if you what shall I say, if you emit 1,000 billion tons of carbon dioxide, the Earth's temperature will go up by 0.45 degrees. Okay. What is our current temperature increase? Somewhere between 1.2 and 1.3 degrees from pre-industrial levels. Okay. So you see in this graph, it is very clear. Look at China, India, Africa at the top. Okay, their share of cumulative emissions, each one of them is about 17–18% of the global population. So all of that is more than half the global population. Their contribution to cumulative emissions is what? Less than 1/3. And if you look at the rest, United States, European Union, and the rest of Europe, which is about 20% of the global population today, their contribution is disproportionately large. This remains the crux of the problem. So we think of this in terms of what is called the global carbon budget. So if the amount of emissions cumulatively of carbon dioxide directly determines the temperature increase. If you want to limit your temperature increase to a particular level, then you have to limit the amount of carbon dioxide that you can emit. So how much is that? That is a little bit of issues of probability, etc. So 50% probability because of various uncertainties associated with climate and our understanding. So 2 degrees centigrade, the total is quite substantial, 3806 billion tons. GT stands for gigatons, which is means billion tons. And for 1.5 degree warming, it is 2956. So what is the current status today? If you take 1.5 degrees, 83% of the carbon budget is gone. Okay. And only 17% remains. 2 degrees centigrade, the life is a little easier, but there is still 65% is gone. So why is this important to us? The point is immediately no country in the world, no economy in the world can 100% switch to renewables. It is technologically infeasible. This is a fact. If it were not a fact, if it were so easy, everybody would have done it. Or at least the better off countries could have done much more than they are doing. So if people cook up all kinds of conspiracy theories about it. I think one important fact to recognize is that technologically 100% renewables is not yet on the agenda. So we have to work towards it. So what does that mean? The ability to emit is not simple, is not pollution. And this is not the right way to think about it. What you have to see in it is actually a resource which countries need for development. It is like a stepping stone to sustainability or using renewable energy. But without the stepping stone, you cannot jump from where you are to the second floor. I mean, it's not going to happen. So this is a common resource for all humanity. And if it is a common resource, it must be shared equitably, and no country or group of countries can appropriate more than their fair share. And this has always been India's principle. This is something that my colleagues and I have worked on scientifically and also as policy, but it has more or less, now it is a common principle which India recognizes. And if you look at the India's submission to the International Court of Justice on the recent hearings on climate change and human rights, you will find that India has articulated this view. So the equitable sharing of the carbon budget is a fundamental foundation of climate equity. And there cannot be, in some sense, if there is such a thing as a right to development, which there is recognized in the UN, and which is considered a part of human rights, then the physical form that this right must take is an equitable share to the global carbon budget. So the overwhelming share, Annex 1 here is UNFCCC language for developed countries. So developed countries until 1990 have taken 71%, even though their population share is 18%. Even after 1991 to 2018 or 2020, their share is 46%. You might think that developing countries, the share has become 54%. But if you take out China, that is only about 32%. So if you leave China out, the rest of us have had a disproportionately lower share of the cumulative emissions. So that's my colleagues and my colleagues from the National Institute of Advanced Studies. We have a website called the Climate Equity Monitor, where you can see many more details of this with more explanations, etc. So if you say that every country has to have only a fair share of the carbon budget, and that has to be roughly based on its population, then when they talk about net zero, eventually you have to stop emitting. So if you want to take, if you have to take only a fair share of this carbon budget, countries like even what is remaining, forget what happened in the past, then all these countries, developed countries, must actually reach net zero by what you see in red, 2025 or 2024, maximum 2035 for the UK. And the entire world also has to reach by 2037. That's a separate story. We'll come back to that. But if you see what the developed countries are saying, the USA is saying 2050, whereas actually they should have finished by 2025. So we are nowhere near the kind of action which is required. And by nowhere near, I mean we are off by 20 years. And we are talking about the richest countries. So you can think of this in terms of carbon debt and credit. Many people don't admit it, but the first person to have this idea of ecological debt was actually Fidel Castro. So, he spoke of ecological debt, and here you can talk of carbon debt and credit. How much respective to your fair share any country has taken extra over its fair share. So you see all of this in USA, EU, Russian Federation, Germany, or UK, all of them have a carbon debt. And countries like China and India has one of the biggest carbon credit, most maximal carbon credits in the world. Because our emissions have been extremely low, India's status I'll just come to. But unfortunately, before we congratulate ourselves on our very low emissions, we must remember that is also because of our lack of development, our extensive continued prevalence of poverty, and our relative lack of industrialization. So it's not something to exactly get too thrilled about. So finally, we have the Paris Agreement. So Paris Agreement, the temperature target was set at 2 degrees centigrade. Below it, 1.5, we will do our very best to achieve it. What happened? Oh. A screen notification came and it threw my share out. No, wait. I think.
Still it is there.
Right. Okay, it's there. It won't disappear. But one of the very important things, the Paris Agreement had okay. So the Paris Agreement, of course, had a temperature target, all very good. But two things they did, and they really succeeded in this. One is the modifying the principle of common but differentiated CBDRRC by adding in the light of different national circumstances. This is actually trying to create a loophole in international law. Of course, it's very difficult to fool the world with this, but trying to create a loophole saying it depends on my circumstances what I can do or cannot do. So it is diluting the principle of a commitment to the extent it was there in the original UNFCCC. The other thing is they completely made it voluntary and self-determined. No, of course, that benefits us also. It's not a fact that it doesn't. But the main thing it did for the developed countries, it removed any talk of a target. So we can decide what we want to do. And obviously, whether they will, we all know whether they will do it in an equitable way or not. The other thing is now, obviously, you have a voluntary agreement. You have to see whether it meets the needs of emissions reduction. So one of the things was that every 5 years we would review this. And this is called the global stock take. At the time of Dubai, if you had noticed, the word was used quite a bit. This is a 5-year review. And then based on the review, everybody would agree, okay, now we must do more. So you talk of what is called developing the ambition, ratcheting up the ambition. It's all, this politics is full of American jargon. So, ratcheting up ambition is the language they use. Then, of course, the 100 billion climate finance commitment was renewed, but they were to upgrade it eventually and decide on the target by 2025. And that was why Baku became the finance COP. So it comes from the Paris Agreement. So you see that I am skipping. Will somebody arrow keys for some reason? You have to use this arrow key. Will somebody do it? Yeah. So you see, I have skipped suddenly from Paris Agreement to Glasgow. Actually, I would have skipped to 2020, but 2020 was the COVID year, so we couldn't obviously have any international conference. So 2021. What happened in these 5 years? In these 5 years, if you look at the usual story of climate politics, people will say, we spent the 5 years preparing to implement the Paris Agreement, creating what is called the Paris Rule Book, creating what is called the all the processes and procedures for implementing the Paris Agreement. That is true, it did happen. But one more thing happened, and because these were the years of Trump. So the United States declared that it would leave the Paris Agreement, but nevertheless, because there is a waiting period to leave the Paris Agreement, it remained in all the negotiations, trying to impose restrictions in combination with the European Union, primarily, on all other developing countries, but not undertaking any action, and in fact going in reverse. So this is a very important lesson for what might happen in the years to come. So for 5 years, actually, if you look back in retrospect, there's a lot of preparation, there was a lot of activity, and countries like India prepared its nationally determined contributions, the entire world did, etc., etc. But in terms of actual climate action, did they do more? The answer is not visibly. Okay, and there was a period of stagnation, which entered in a variety of ways. So in Glasgow, when we finally met, perhaps it is better if I come to this. So Glasgow, they were in the developed countries were in a hyperactive mode. So they said 2 degrees centigrade, forget it. Most dangerous is that you should not cross 1.5 at any cost. 2 degrees centigrade, we don't know how to cope. Everything should be focused on 1.5. Now, of course, this is very good if you are doing it in good faith. But the problem is you are saying all this while you yourself are doing nothing towards reducing your emissions at a rate sufficient to meet this 1.5 target. Then they wanted a net zero commitment from all. So you see, this net zero commitment is a bit of a fraud. This is like saying, if you have water supply in some area, and you say everybody must take their fair share of water, and somebody says, na koda vandu, I will close that tap at 8 o'clock in the evening. That is fine. Of course, you have to close that tap. But how much water will you take is the issue, no? Not when you will close the tap. So, promising to close the tap without saying how much water you will consume is not very useful, and it does not make sense. But this is the strategy of the developed countries. So, of course, we can also play the game. So, we set 2070. Though within, if we talk about our fair share of the carbon budget, at the current rate of our consumption of the carbon budget, we can go much farther in terms of our net zero. It can be much later. But they started talking about the declining carbon budget because it becomes a scientific fact. You cannot avoid it. But they refused to talk about equitable sharing of the carbon budget. So they impose global targets for emissions reduction on everybody. But these are based on projections and models and a lot of calculations, but which do not account for equity between countries. They do not take care of our developmental needs. They do not even guarantee food security for the future. So they work with such models. Food security because they say they assume that so much trees can be planted, so much afforestation can take place, which will reduce the capacity for agriculture production, etc., etc., etc. So these are several, and part of on countries like the emerging economies like China, India, Saudi Arabia, etc. Their idea is to impose emissions reduction restrictions. On countries of sub-Saharan Africa, other developing countries of Latin America, the idea is actually to restrict their growth. Okay? And this is the strategy partly they try to pursue. Next. So there is all this talk of urgency, alarm, we must keep 1.5 within reach. And then some new report comes, the UN Secretary General talks of global boiling, not global warming. All this does not help, is all very well. But all this does not help if you are not taking action. So what is part of this? Part of this rhetoric is to create urgency and alarm and panic. Of course, it happens in their own society. So yesterday you saw all these climate activists going around spraying the Christmas trees with orange paint. So, it leads to that kind of actions in their own society. But also it puts pressure on developing countries to do something. When in fact, if you take a more sober view of the situation, you will see other alternatives. Next. So then we had the first, keep putting, I think I have to speed up. So the last Dubai conference of parties, that was, of course, was much more widely advertised and sort of made much more headlines than the current one. And there, of course, the first review concluded. And of course, the developed countries are in a hurry to have a review. So we started reviewing a Paris Agreement which had not started implementation until 2021. It was supposed to start in 2020, but you had COVID. So we started in 2021. So within 2 years, we were reviewing it. So obviously, the balance sheet was not very good. So they said, no, we will talk about the future. So there were new global targets like tripling globally renewable energy, doubling the rate of increase of energy efficiency, etc., etc. But in all these targets, there is no differentiation, no separate targets for how much developed countries would do and how much developing countries will do. So this is the crux of the problem. So if you take a country in sub-Saharan Africa, typically whose energy consumption, electricity consumption annually is less than the year's electricity consumption of an American refrigerator, then what do you mean asking them to cut emissions? Does it make sense? In fact, even in India, I would say if you take parts of India, I don't want to name states. If you take parts of India, especially the poorest states, in terms of per capita income, etc., you will find there also the lowest bottom 50% of our population will be in the same state of electricity consumption. So this is something which the developed countries never recognize. And ultimately in Dubai, what they are now wanting is, first you agreed that all contributions are voluntary. You did that because you wanted to escape commitments, you meaning developed countries. Now you come around, you realize this is not working. Emissions are reducing, not reducing fast enough. Now we say, no, 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 we made a mistake. So we now have to introduce some other binding, quote unquote, or, some constraints on this voluntary character. So which developing countries said, then you have to have a fresh discussion. You cannot have the same discussion. So this was a debate that began in Dubai. Next. But then you had this some positive things in Dubai, and this was the story of how much climate finance is needed. So we are already at the 6 o'clock mark, so I'll take about 5 to 10 minutes and wrap up. So the figures are startling. So developing countries in their commitments to Paris, which is the Paris Agreement, which is called the nationally determined contribution, they say how many trillion, they say how much finance they need, and totally this amounts to 5.8, 5.9 trillion dollars up to 2030 alone. 2020 to 2030. Trillion is 1,000 billion. These guys have not even reached 100 billion, okay, in climate finance. So if you look at adaptation, which is dealing with the consequences of climate change, and one very important thing about the world, which you must realize, from the disproportionate way emissions have occurred, that the world is really divided into those who have created the problem and those who are suffering the consequences. So if you take the bottom 50% of the world's emitters in terms of emissions, they have contributed only 15% of emissions, and the bulk of them have a per capita income of less than $3 per day. So it is really the world's poor have a minimal contribution. So, for these people, adaptation is extremely important. And the percentage of climate finance going to adaptation is minimal. So these numbers are very important. That 100 billion you're talking about, that target has not been reached. And this has been noted. But even though the target is on, they claim 80%, 89%, the way developing countries look at it, we don't think it is worth more than 35 to 40% billion dollars. So where is that? Where is the USD 215, 387 billion, and where is that 5.8, 5.9 trillion? So there is a huge finance gap, and this has been acknowledged in the Dubai COP decisions. Next. So this is the background to what happened in Baku. I have taken my time arriving at Baku, but if you just parachute into Baku, like many of our journalist colleagues do, and you just pick up all the hype going around, you don't see what is, it looks like shadow boxing. Many people honestly come away with the impression that all of this is useless. This simply cannot be the answer, because global warming is a global challenge. And if we do not do it together, there's no other way to do it. And you cannot say individuals will do it, because individuals don't give guarantees. If you have Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy in charge, the world cannot be trusted in their hands. So you need somebody to regulate characters like that. not to mention our own leading lights. Okay, so who is to control them? So governments sitting together as public action is essential to solving global warming. So whether we like it or not, even if the COP does not always produce results, that is why we go back every year to talk, negotiate, discuss, and see what can be done. So what did the developed countries do? The developed countries further and said, basically, no money. They started at 200, so everybody laughed at them. So in fact, the developing countries held a press conference where speaking on behalf of countries like China, India, Pakistan, Bolivia, Venezuela, Cuba, etc., the leader of the Bolivian delegation said, this is a joke. 200 billion is a joke. So that is the reality. Then they went up to 250. Then after a long song and dance, they went up to 300 billion, but that was it. So what is their attitude? Their attitude was, there's no shortage of money. There's plenty of money. Trillions of dollars are waiting. You guys don't know how to get it. So you have to provide the conditions where private investment will come. And if that comes, that will happen. Which private investor is going to invest in better productivity for the small farmer? These are not things which give you returns. Who is going to provide disaster relief? Is that something on which you can get returns on investment? So saying you attract private investment to adaptation and loss and damage is also another joke. So this was the problem. But then on the other hand, they imposed a whole lot of restrictions, undermining equity, or rather trying to impose restrictions in the name of following up on the conclusions at Dubai about how climate action has to be speeded up, etc. So finally, there's one more. So finally, the developing countries said no. So actually, the standoff in Dubai has two sides to it. One is the finance story, and the fact that their finance was inadequate, and even if a lot of countries welcomed the decision, a lot of countries also said either they absolutely rejected the decision, meaning they said the decision is inadequate, rejected whether they legally do it is a later story. But they rejected in the spirit of saying this is inadequate. They rejected the decision or said it is hugely inadequate. At the same time, the other side of this, of course, is widely reported. Everybody has read about it. But the other side is the developing countries said, we cannot undertake action as you demand. Because without the wherewithal to do it, without your saying what you will do, this is simply not something we can accept. So Baku was a proper standoff. Next, I'll skip these details, so details are not relevant, but I think I have conveyed the gist of what is really happened at Baku. Next. So it is not as if nothing happens at a COP. There were two areas in which we had some progress. One was on adaptation. It's a discussion that the developed countries don't like, because it ends up talking about poverty, the means of implementation, poverty eradication, vulnerability. All of these are words they don't like. So they always talk about how difficult it is to measure, it is complicated. Of course, it is complicated. It is much easier to talk of mitigation. But if you don't talk about adaptation, then are you saying that the 50% of the world is compelled to do what it can to survive and the rest of us don't bother? So obviously this cannot be the solution. So adaptation is a difficult discussion, but which developing countries push. So that was very important. But even here, developed countries have a new agenda. So there is always some new twist they will introduce. And now they have started talking about transformative change. Meaning We have to change our values. They actually say this, and this is quite ridiculous. We have to change our values and worldviews. We have to change our way we run our economy, our governance, everything, in order to cope with the consequences of climate change. But climate change that they have created, and they are not talking about what they will change in their societies. And if you look at the recent results of elections in developed countries, it is clear that there is a lot of governance and politics which has to be transformed in developed countries and not in developing countries. So this was another major issue. Next. And finally, this story about carbon trading. So everybody is now talking about it. Unfortunately, even more than the central government, which is a little cautious, depending on which ministry you are talking to, our state governments are very enthusiastic about carbon trading. Now, I don't want to get into the details, but you can just show. But the basic issue is that if you talk about carbon trading, it is like, how should I say? There are, it is like depending on market forces and attracting investments and returns thereof in order to enforce mitigation. But you know, whenever you leave such actions to markets, who suffers? The bottom 75%, not even 50%. 75% will suffer. Are we successful in using markets to overcome hunger? Not at all. Everywhere, the poor suffer with food markets. Are we successful with markets in order to improve our agriculture? No, because otherwise, why are farmers agitating for minimum support price? That is a non-market intervention. So this whole idea that markets will solve everything is very problematic, and especially when it involves buying and selling, how much emissions you have reduced. And when we have emissions to our credit and they are debtors, how does it make sense for us to sell carbon space to them? Sell our emissions reductions to them. So this is a very poor idea. Many people think this is climate finance. Government of India does not accept this is climate finance. There is, you find a lot of incorrect statements going around in the literature or in public statements, even by government officials, but this is not correct. Unfortunately, if you open up carbon trading, one other consequence is that private parties can make gains. But the end result will be an increased national burden on mitigation. So which sector, if at all we allow carbon trading, which sector, what kind of companies, what kind of entities are allowed to engage in carbon trading is a very important issue. We have not thought about it sufficiently in this country, and this is a challenge for the future. Next, and this is the... So what are the challenges ahead? COP30, which is the next year's COP, which will happen in Brazil. Everything is different. Mr. Trump is in office after the first week of January. Let us wait, watch and see. Now, of course, you ask the Europeans, they say, no, no, we should not give up. Let us wait and see. I mean, really. Even everyone in this room is laughing. All of us know what Trump will do. And this time, Trump is saying that not only is he going to leave the Paris Agreement, which was what they did last time, but they are going to leave the UNFCCC itself. Okay? And unfortunately, we should, sometimes it happens they leave, but other countries are so scared that the US is not there. They say, no, 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 but please come and sit in the negotiation. So I think these are all very serious issues which are going to come up. How much of this Trump will do immediately? Will he delay, etc.? All this remains to be seen. But if things are as they are on track, apart from buying the Panama Canal, apart from buying Greenland, And what else did he want to buy? Apart from making Canada the 51st state, he will also walk out of the UNFCCC. So this is really an issue. The EU and other OECD countries, though lip service they pay to the Paris Agreement, etc., and all of them have strong environmental lobbies. Even with right-wing governments, they also have strong environmental lobbies. You should not think that all environmental groups in the European countries are left-wing. They are not. There are a lot of right-wing groups. So, but they are all very clear. They are not going to offer any radically different higher emission reductions, nor are they going to make up for what US will not do potentially. So they will say China and India. So obviously that is not something. China can take its own decision, but for India there is no question that we can compensate for what the others will not do. Unfortunately, Brazil is still talking about Mission 1.5, saying we must limit emissions to 1.5 temperature increase to 1.5 warming. This is not going to be possible. And this is basically it is out of reach. However, if you take the attitude, yes, we will also contribute and take some kind of commitments to climate action based on 1.5, which is not going to be reached, that is a trap. So that one has to be careful. And the most important lesson from Baku is whatever else you talk about, whatever else you have on the board, development is the key. Development, especially what you call human development, social development, economic growth, all of these are essential. Without this, we do not have the basis for neither mitigation nor adaptation. And so, if we really have to look at the future, development is important. And all this talk about green opportunity, etc., etc., all of this you have to be very careful, whether it is green, blue, red, orange, yellow, whatever kind of development, everything costs money. It needs resources. And it is not as if, you can, like some magic snapping the fingers, change your development to end up. And, people imagine we can save the world. I agree, it's a good goal to want to save the world. But with less than 3% cumulative emissions so far, India is in no, and our annual emissions being per capita emissions being about 1/3 of the world figure. I think there is, we should be realistic. We cannot save the world if the world will not save itself. So we have to prepare for its consequences, and that the basic strategy has to be built on development. So I'll stop here and thank you. So I have run over.
Thank you, TJ. I think a lot has been covered. I think in a short time, it would definitely take a while. Process this complex, but start from where we left out. Then I think we have a lot of questions because there's not enough to discuss on that. So there is one sort of stream of opinion, is like especially in academia and in some sects of the activist circle, that mitigation, even for the global, the developing countries such as India, a quick transition to a quick green transition, so to speak, or a quick move to sustainable energy and the green energy and green agriculture and green land policies will also lead to as a core benefit to development and poverty eradication and stuff like that. How do you sort of respond to that? I mean, it seems completely misplaced, but it seems to have taken traction very much in a lot of circles.
See, that's a very important question. So there is a sort of a cruder version of this argument, which also very common. Oh, India will suffer the consequences of climate change. Global warming is a very vulnerable country. So we must reduce our emissions immediately. No, it is not as if, I burn some wood here and I have global warming here. Does not depend on where the warming takes place. It's a global phenomenon. So even if I switch off all energy in our country, all use of energy, all emissions, if we miraculously stop, how much can we save the world? Nothing. We will postpone the crossing of 1.5 by a few years. On the other hand, if the entire world were to emit as much as India emits today on a per capita basis, and you take this, everybody emits at the same rate, then the world's vegetation will take up most of these emissions. And all you need to absorb is some 3 million tons. So, so you have to have this person. It's truly a global problem. The other problem, however, is we are not talking of simply, replacing for a household some grid connection by solar panel. We are talking of the entire economy. And we do not even understand, I will emphasize this, except in a very rough, crude ways, what exactly this means, the green transition. So what we should do is we should proceed cautiously, step by step, making sure that the burden is equitably distributed. Okay? And that, unfortunately, even though we do it in a well-meaning way, this is not happening. So, for instance, renewable energy in India is given priority over solar power and wind power is given priority, not so much hydropower, I'm not sure. Solar and wind is given priority when available over power from thermal sources. And in fact, during COVID, this status was enhanced. It's called must-run status. But because of this must-run status, we are not using coal power. So the 4 southern states, my colleagues have estimated, are paying upwards of spending upward of 1,500 crore rupees annually in terms of electricity tariff. So our great achievement and consumption of renewable energy is not coming for free. It is coming for 1,500 crores, which the annually, which the people and the industry, etc., are paying. So it increases cost of energy. So I think whether it's electric vehicles, whether it is renewable energy, take for instance now the WHO is promoting energy audit of primary health sector. I think first of all, whether there is 24-hour electricity is not very clear. Okay? They are not doing audits of medicine. They are not doing audit of vaccines. They are not doing audit of availability of personnel, but they are saying they will do an energy audit of PHC. Is this a priority? These. So I think this idea somehow that the green development is fixed, structured to prosperity. It has no scientific or economic basis. Right. So maybe
Specs, and then you can pass it on.
Yeah.
This one.
That's for our friends on Zoom.
So Quite interesting session, sir. So I have a doubt. So you were saying that India is the largest generator of carbon credits. So I think that India had generated a lot of carbon credits through the Kyoto Protocol CDM mechanism, and most of those millions of credits that India has generated remains unsold in the India's inventory. So the thing is, right now they have dumped this Kyoto Protocol and moved on to this Paris Agreements, Article 6.2 and 6.4. So when it comes to 6.2, it's more of consensus, and uh, two countries can bilaterally decide upon the mechanisms on which they try to engage. So now they have agreed with 6.4. What if India goes generate 6.2 credits and it remains unsold, like how CDM is? So that's the first thing. And the second thing is, a lot of developed countries and Western countries are demanding India and China to contribute more towards this climate change mitigation and debt relief of highly debted countries, which are mostly third world countries. The thing is, uh, let's take Switzerland is a major buyer of carbon credits, and mostly they're buying from countries like Peru, Malawi, or
Who?
Switzerland.
Their main contract is with Gabon. But anyway, please
Yeah,
go
yeah.
ahead.
So a lot of Western countries, including Switzerland, buys these carbon credits from countries like Peru, Malawi, and other African nations. So even if India generates a lot of credits, only if the developed countries thinks that India is worth of their climate finance, they'll buy those credits, and it will have a demand in the market, right? So basically the thing is, the CDM credits remain unsold. What will happen to it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
See, no. So I'll give a very quick reply to you because it may be too abstract. The answer will become too technical and will not be fair to the rest of the audience. But let me put it very simply. So what was this CDM credit story? So CDM credit story was, see, I am finding it difficult to reduce emissions. You will find it easy. Why? Because you are a poor country. Why will a poor country find it easier to reduce emissions? Because in some sense you are saying you are already your emissions on low. So further loss of emissions or further restricting of growth is not such a problem for you. This is the whole basic idea. Whether it works in practice is a different question. The basic idea is like saying all of us must go on hunger strike. We are protesting against the government. எல்லாரும் உண்ணாவிரதம் இருக்கணும். But உண்ணாவிரதம் இருக்கிறதுல, if you are used to eating 3 times a day, உண்ணாவிரதம் இருக்கிறது கஷ்டம். If you are a poor person and used to eating only once a day, உண்ணாவிரதம் இருக்கிறது ஒன்றும் ப்ராப்ளம் இல்லைல்ல, காலையிலேருந்து சாயந்தரம் வரைக்கும் anyway you are starving. So the argument works like this. So this is unfortunately the basic idea of the CDM. But CDMல ஒரு விதிவிலக்கு இருந்தது. There was a issue. And that safety valve was, we did not have any emission reduction commitment. We were only committed to a low carbon path of development. Whereas on the other side, they had a targeted emissions reduction. So we did reduce some emissions, and correspondingly those emissions reduction are credited to them, meaning avanga kanakla varudhu as emissions reduced, for which they give us some money. Already there was a problem because the carbon space is a national resource, but the buying and selling is by private parties. So is it taking place in the right sectors? Is it taking place in a fair and equitable way? Was never discussed. We never taxed the carbon credits. And in fact, a few companies made windfall profits without any technology transfer, which was supposed to happen, actually happening. So there was a lot of criticism. இப்போ என்னன்னா, this carbon trading under 6.4, which is similar to CDM under the Paris Agreement broadly. We have a mitigation commitment. We have our NDC. So if a private party sells its emissions reduction away, okay, in exchange for transfer of credits or whatever, who will make up that shortfall? That emissions reduction cannot be counted in our favor. It will go to the buyer. So basically, it is private profit, and the nation has to make up that sale of carbon. This has not been figured out. And Government of India correctly is careful. So even though we have a national carbon market, which we are developing, this national carbon market is still not open to connecting with the carbon market elsewhere. So this CDM credits, because we were owed money, we have allowed it to be transferred. But there is still the issue whether if those parties which benefit from those credits, how will the nation as the country economy as a whole make up for those loss of carbon space? This is an unanswered question. So I think this is not such a thing. Developed countries, this Gabon, etc., 6.2, all of it eventually is a way to avoid drastic emissions reduction in your countries. In fact, the European Union has said, Switzerland may do what it wants. In the European Union quota, you are not allowed to use these 6.4 credits for your emissions target, and that is correct. So there's a somewhat technical reply, but since that was the question. Anyway, yeah.
Yes, sir. Actually, like I felt that throughout the conversation, you were skeptical of like developed countries telling developing countries that you have to transition your grid, we have to do a green transition, etc. But can't the argument be made that, for example, in India, we are like diplomatically, while we are in this conference, like in COP28, I believe there was talk about phasing out coal eventually, and then we were talking about instead of phase out, phase down coal, etc. But and domestically, we are still building more coal capacity, like coal thermal power plants, etc. So like even if you leave aside like the emissions talk, like the climate change talk, coal, like the thermal power plants, they are massive. They are like massive air pollution consequences. They are like health consequences. They have political consequences because coal power, but the coal barons who are like who own mines, who are operating mines, they have big political influence in our country. So can't the argument be made that even if we don't agree with the developed countries on that matter, we should still put more effort into transitioning away from thermal power into renewables or nuclear or whatever?
Yeah. Good question. And this is, I think, a very common question. And I mean, I've heard it. It's a sort of daily. So you will, I must apologize because I hope I don't sound dismissive, because it is my daily job to deal with this question. So I answer it on a daily basis. So that by way of. So what is the story with coal? First of all, air pollution and climate mitigation have some overlap, but they are not goals which are coterminous, meaning they are not identical goals. So you take the example of Beijing. Now everybody is upset about New Delhi. You take the example of Beijing. 15 years ago, Beijing was like Delhi today. And we were acting as if we were, we moved industries out of Delhi. We are doing something, look at Beijing. But now we are where Beijing is. But Beijing is not where we are. Beijing is clean. Has China stopped using coal? No.
It's called FRGs.
No. Just wait. So China has not stopped coal. In fact, China is still building coal power plants, etc. What did China do? China took air pollution measures. So introducing flue gas dispensers, electrostatic precipitators, and in our case, if you take cities like Delhi, there is also simply raw wood burning for heat and cooking purposes across the entire city. So we have a range of issues on air pollution which can be dealt with without shutting down coal thermal plants. And in fact, India's coal thermal plants, it has also to do with the kind of coal you use. So, our flue stacks are now sufficiently high. So I don't think they are a problem like they were earlier. Fly ash we can use to convert into other products. But unfortunately, what happens is we want to shift to high sulfur coal, and that creates a new set of problems without using some of our domestic resources adequately. And as for political power, of coal companies, I must remind you that there are a lot of very politically powerful energy companies on which are doing both thermal power and renewable power. And the latest sort of issues which are arising in this context, I refer to the Adani renewable contracts, have arisen in the name of renewable energy. So it's not as if there is political power at play only in thermal power. It is very much there in renewable also. Ultimately, the problem is you have to balance between the shall we say, the overall burden in terms of disease, loss of well-being, etc., which arises from lack of income through lack of development, vis-a-vis the direct causes such as pollution. So pollution is a visible and direct cause. But at the same time, if you do not have development, then that also has huge costs. And it may not be easy to calculate, but they are as expensive and as much a problem for our people as direct pollution. So I think the scientific evidence is clear that climate change and air pollution, climate change mitigation and air pollution are not the same goals. Achieving climate change air pollution reduction dramatically is possible, and it has been done all over the world without necessarily giving up our use of coal for renewable energy. And the prospects of sort of bypassing the use of fossil fuels entirely is not something which is technologically, economically, or scientifically possible. And so we cannot dream of first world conditions of life if we have not completed our first world like tasks of development. So this is the setting. There is a lot of literature on this. If you want, we can refer to you. I can tell you about it later. Okay. Yeah.
First of all, I would like to thank the Indian government actually participating on the climate change, standing against and putting all the developing countries together. You want an equitable share on that. The point you raised on the equitable share, right? So that's a really appreciable one. But other points I would like to get clarified is even the policy making between the developing countries and the developed countries, and also the point that you raised. We should have an economic activities in the developing countries, right? The other things I'm hearing is the developed countries mandating the import on the green steel and other things, quoting green and green, right?
Yeah.
So even if the policy making stand out, right? The private sectors, yeah, even the policy making is a standout on a neutrality and the equitable, contributions, right? Accountability on perspective. How do we counter on this private sector's demanding for some mandate on the imported items, like when I said on green steels?
Our friend is referring to the fact that the European countries are now saying that if you export to the European Union and the emissions involved in your products do not meet our standards, okay, then we will tax you. Why are they doing it? Because they produce some of those products themselves. So if they put, do not tax us, we will be cheaper. So they are basically protecting their industry. But anytime we put produce make in India requirement, all these fellows run to the WTO and say, no, 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 you cannot do this. You are putting unnecessary tariff barrier. So this is protectionism. Okay. Developing countries have protested vehemently about this. This was a continuous debate in both in before Dubai, at Dubai, and at Baku. Every opportunity this would be raised. Unfortunately, the big industry in India has one foot here, one foot there. So you remember the late Mr. Ratan Tata, when he was asked how you will choose your successor, he said it depends, it can be anyone, not necessarily Indian. 60% of my revenue comes from abroad, and so I will do whatever. So clearly, there is a section of our industry which has one foot there. Is not poor, our poor MSME, which is struggling to survive, which is the issue. The real issue is big industry, which has one foot there, one foot here, okay, and wants to be the good boy there and the good, sort of play along here, are saying, in fact, I was quite surprised at Dubai, while the government and others were really arguing over these restrictions, the Confederation of Indian Industry held a meeting and they said, no, no, there is no problem with this tax. It is very good for us. It will improve technology. And this statement was led by the chairman of the current chairperson of the Tata Sons. So this is the problem. Now, do we have a problem with our small scale sector? Yes. Our MSME sector has a problem. Tamil Nadu, we are particularly concerned. However, some NGOs, international NGOs, try to make, hay while the sun shines, as they say. So they are conducting workshops on how to improve and reduce emissions so that you can meet these restrictions. I think we need a combination of, yes, sometimes we'll have to adjust to what are the pressures from externally. Second is we must also mount diplomatic pressure, and that I think the free trade agreements are not being signed. There are all kinds of blocks, and Commerce Ministry at sometimes says, yes, we will try to accommodate, but other times we have been very clear that, you cannot simply make impositions of this kind, unilateral imposition. So this is an ongoing debate, like many other debates in the WTO. It's a very serious issue, I agree with you, that trying to, when you cannot convince us in a fair way on policy, you try to introduce trade restrictions and forces. Correct. I agree with that.
Good evening, sir.
Yeah.
Thank you for this great session. But India will planning to achieve net zero emissions by 2070. But currently we are facing a lot of climate related problems like global warming effect, climate change, sea level rise. But my question is, as a citizen, what we will do to reduce these climate related problems, and what are the initiatives our government will take to achieve net zero emissions by 2070? Thanks.
See, this is always, I think, an honest question, and anybody who's concerned about global warming and feels, something needs to be done, has always faced this question. But then I will draw your attention to something like, say, unemployment. Unemployment is an immediate and burning problem for us today. In fact, it has been there for several decades to greater or lesser degree. In the last few years, there is some fears that even if unemployment figures are not risen so dramatically, the quality of employment has deteriorated significantly. More people have gone back to agriculture and things like that. So unemployment is a burning problem, and perhaps as burning as climate change, or maybe even more important in the next, in terms of the next 5 years. But what can an individual citizen do about it? There's a limit, right? You can look for new opportunities. Okay, if you are a business person, you can say, okay, instead of investing $10 million on my son's wedding, I will invest it in productive employment and give employment to people. You can do that. That is a possibility. Instead of wasting money on foreign tours and trips, you can spend money on usefully generating activities and livelihoods for people. You can do more philanthropy in the field of livelihoods. If you are wealthy, you can do this. What will I do? I can train people for new occupations. I can do innovation if I am a scientist. But the way the economy runs is not only a question of what I want or what I feel or what I desire, but it's a political and economic question. And therefore, there is politics behind this. And that is why at every COP, you find a few thousand young people coming from all over the world, not because they are getting any benefits, not because they are doing anything, getting any, in fact, paying with their own money, etc., to come there, saying this is a political problem. So I think that is the point. Of course, as citizens, you can be more energy efficient. I agree. But to be energy efficient, you have to improve your quality of equipment, and that equipment will cost. See, we have given in a very nice scheme, good scheme. See, this improved Chula used to be the trademark of sustainable development activity 15 years ago. Now with this LPG schemes which have come, this improved Chula has gone out of the window. I personally think that is a good thing. Improved chulas never really work, unfortunately. They will work very well in the lab, they will work well in the pilot, but when you actually give it on a mass scale, improved chulas never gave results. So good you have LPG, but if you give connections to people, then people are unable, after the first few concessional cylinders, they cannot do it for anything. So for water heating and roti making and rice, maybe they will keep the chula. And they will keep the gas only for the guest who comes and you have to suddenly prepare tea. So even if you desire to be environmentally sustainable or lower your energy footprint, which is the first step, it requires resources to be able to do this. And this, I think, is part of the issue. So individual actions, yes, in some cases. You can be more encourage rainwater harvesting, yes. I have neighbors who are redeveloping their plots but are not doing rainwater harvesting. So all that is you can do. But at the same time, stop throwing litter on the streets, you help organize garbage collection. All of this can help in small ways. But the crux of the problem is, however, political and economic. And we have to learn how to deal with it.
1, 2, 3. Okay, only 2 more. Can we take a few questions and then maybe answer?
Yeah.
Okay, we have to wind up this.
Good evening, sir. Hello. 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 Good evening, sir. Good for good session though. I have a few questions.
Okay, continue.
Yeah. There are limitations to
You have
planting
to
trees.
hold it directly like that.
My range was.
Sir, there are limitations to planting trees. So is carbon capture, utilization, storage, or nuclear energy gives the ultimate goal to climate change? One question. One more is the climate trading part of $300 billion climate commitment?
Good evening, sir. My question is about the net zero year, the target year set by the developed countries. Are they intentionally slowing down their net zero activities? I mean, for the developed countries, are they intentionally slowing down their net zero activities? As for my knowledge, they could have done the net zero activity somewhat earlier, not 2050. Right. This is my question, sir. Are they intentionally slowing down?
There's one behind.
Good evening, sir. So my question was so straightforward. So what was the role that the non-state actors can play in driving the climate change agreements and the gap which is being left out by the national governments? And what can the state actors can do to have a control over the non-state actors' actions?
That's a very good question. I think one. Huh? We are just. I get one last.
I can wait if you want to answer.
No,
Okay.
we may not have time afterwards.
Yeah.
So,
Two quick questions. One, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, you mentioned that the national government is apprehensive about carbon trading, whereas the state governments seem more enthusiastic about it.
over enthusiastic, I would say.
Yeah. If you can just throw some light on that and which state governments in particular, I'm just curious. The second is very quickly in recent times, the recent COP coverage, I see a lot of questions about the credibility of the COP process itself, and which is also something that you touched upon, especially with funding or the presence of fossil fuel lobbyists or being chaired by a minister of oil, so on and so forth. So your thoughts on the overall credibility of or rather the media coverage of the credibility of the COP process.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, let me very quickly, first about carbon capture and storage. Carbon and capture and storage is mostly still good ideas, a few pilots, but nothing for large-scale deployment. So right now we are having all kinds of discussions over it. As a subject of research, should it continue? Yes, it should. But I don't include solar geoengineering in that category. Apart from that, I think it can continue. But if you say that my climate policy is to be based on that, I'll say no, thank you. Well, this is not going to work. Nuclear power, yes, nuclear power is going to be very important. The lot of anti-nuclear power advocates around the world have changed their position. Now, what Germany has done is it got rid of its nuclear power, but the money being subsidizing their getting rid of nuclear power is being paid by Sweden. How does that happen? Because Germany said no nuclear power. So there is no what is called baseload power. If there is no sun and the wind is not blowing, then you need power. No, you cannot say "Kaathu varla, sir." No power. It doesn't work. So when you want baseload power, there is no nuclear baseload power. Under the EU rules, South Sweden is supposed to provide that power to Germany. So as a result, consumers in South Sweden are being deprived of the power. So they are buying power in the spot market at much higher prices. So this is the story. So we need nuclear very badly. However, do you have to be careful? Yes, you have to be careful, and various things associated with that is important. The other thing is about deforestation. Very quickly, you must keep in mind that forests will not simply, the amount of carbon they will absorb now may change as global warming proceeds, and in several species, several types of forests, this will happen. So the carbon sinks as somehow, the sort of this infinite global dustbin into which you can keep throwing carbon is a very bad idea. So I think deforestation, that way you are correct. But you were saying about carbon credits, 300 billion. That's an interesting, very important question. In fact, I have not thought about it, but I think as far as Government of India is concerned, carbon trading does not count as climate finance. The three conditions we require for this is that it must be new and additional, meaning it should not replace aid globally or as per the country. It must be new and additional. It must be concessional, loans or grant outright. Okay, and it must be based on the needs with a focus on adaptation of developing countries. This is our definition of climate finance. Carbon credits don't fit. Okay, your question quickly remember.
Are they deliberately slowing down net zero?
Are they deliberately slowing down? Of course. In fact, they build it into all their models. Every 5 years, IPCC produces a report. Every 5 years in this report, they produce new projections, okay, of how much all countries must do to reduce emissions in order to keep temperature limits so and so. Do they take into account the inaction of the previous years? They don't. So unfortunately, the answer is very much yes. They intentionally slow down. And even more important, what we don't realize, in developing countries, public sectors play a huge role. And that will come to the question about non-state actors as well. So public sector plays a huge role. So when we in India say 500 gigawatt as the target for renewable energy, you can be confident beyond a point that the government will arm twist private players and say, where is the target? Or we will offer incentives, etc. The US in its latest NDC has said, yes, we are going to, the updated NDC, we are going to reduce by 60% our emissions below 2005 by 2035, which is not a fair share. They are doing much less. But they are saying, but of course, we are a federal country. All this has to be implemented by states and other entities. So it depends on the right conditions. So what we don't realize that all the developed country commitments are market dependent. And so non-state actors, you see, non-state actors is a slogan, meaning those non-governmental sectors who are scientists, multinational banks, all kinds of people, movements, activists. What can non-state actors do? Non-state actors cannot give a legal guarantee that a target will be reached. They have no standing to do that. Or they must be willing to accept with which multinational will sign an agreement with the government of India saying I will reduce by emissions by so much unless I tell them to reduce. Do you think this is going to happen? They voluntarily announced, but now they are all Google after it discovered AI is saying, no, I need too much energy for my data centers. So my net zero target is in trouble. So non-state actors are not accountable. Shareholder meeting like ESG target protest, that's not going to work. Okay? Accountability rests with governments. So the developed countries use this non-state argument to provoke activism in or some forces in developing countries to undermine our political agenda. Unfortunately, this is a fact. I don't say, therefore, that they don't have democratic rights. But unfortunately, also, it is true that there is a whole series of actors who, you see, you don't see, for a country, not even India, smaller countries, you don't even have to create an actual ban on new investment in coal. All you have to create is a atmosphere whereby investment gets deterred. They say, you're too much risk. Why will I go there? So this is the sort of scarce stories about stranded assets, etc. So the problem with non-state actors is that they are not accountable, and that is a serious problem. Otherwise, if there is voluntary sort of, trying to do, or philanthropy, helping farmers, etc., scientists who are looking for new ways of doing things, all of that is very important. So non-state actors, in the sense that after all the state encompasses the entire nation, and therefore everybody, all as parts of society are part of climate action, is absolutely correct. So that's the sort of balance I think we should have on this issue. Subnational entities, like our state government enthusiasm for net zero. And okay, I will say even the Kerala government. I was a member of the Kerala State Planning Board. So I am not politically opposed to the government, but I think their net zero target is not well conceived. It shows enthusiasm, but not science. They have a adaptation mission, but under the goals of the adaptation mission, they have electric vehicles, carbon trading, etc. This is confusion, scientific confusion. So I think, unfortunately, in Tamil Nadu, there is not so much confusion, but on the other hand, it's totally mitigation centric. And the examples that the faith that they have in carbon trading is all very well, but there is no provision for safeguarding the rights of communities. They all want carbon credits in forestry, agriculture, and all kinds of community resources tomorrow. In natural resources, how do you protect the interests of communities? And that is something which is simply, if today a farmer signs an agreement for carbon sequestration through agroforestry on his land by planting 20 trees. Basically, nothing fancy. He'll plant trees so it saves carbon on the Varapula, on the bund of the plot. Now, tomorrow he sells the land. Is the new owner responsible for that carbon credit? So is that an encumbrance on the land? So how do we factor this in? Nobody has thought about it. And it's very difficult to find out whether farmers or rural people actually get benefit. A new paper by some colleagues from Delhi suggests that they don't. So this is what you have to be careful about. Have I answered all? What was the
media narrative around COP and ineffectiveness of COP?
I see the ineffectiveness of COP, this whole story arises out of the wrong expectations from the COP. So if you look at my sort of presentation today, what do you think is my take? Let me tell you. Is climate change a problem? Yes, climate change is a problem. I mean, I'm not a denier, far from it. And in fact, my original work, the way I got into this, was because I felt to some extent in the pre-Copenhagen period, we were not sufficiently engaged with the real challenges of global warming. But having said that, what about development? What about the balance between climate and development? What about the fact that climate action will take place in an unequal world? So do we say we won't go to the UN Security Council and debate security issues? No, we go. But is the UN Security Council able to solve all the problems that arise in the world? No, obviously no. So only the American right wing says, no, we will leave the Security Council, it is useless. No other country says that. Seriously, we don't say it. We say we are a responsible nation, and I think even though the rhetoric comes from quarters you may not agree with politically, but this is basic Indian position is this. We are a responsible country. We have a duty to the world, but we also have a duty to our people who are 17% of the global population. We have responsibility. And it is this band of peace, security, sustainability are important to us as well. So in that sense, we cannot disengage from COP. Are there ways to improve it? Yes, maybe. We should be open to it, I think. So that's the balance. And the media, this news cycle, no? Ayo, COP வரப்போகுது அப்புறம் ஐயோ COP நடந்துருச்சு அப்புறம் ஐயோ COP failure. So, the sound bite. And then since Copenhagen, before Copenhagen, they never did it. Now, after Copenhagen, whenever a minister is walking in the corridor, some 3 television fellows will run behind him. That's part of the news cycle. So I don't think you should take that too seriously. But there is no alternative. We have to go to COPs, not because they are the best way to do it, but because there is right now no other way to do it. So I think that's the thing. I think I've answered all questions.
Yeah,
I think so. Yeah.
I think, thank you, TJ, for that lecture. I think there's a lot of questions pending even now, but for the paucity of time, we can't take any more. But I invite you to meet with Professor TJ after the event, if he's also willing for it. I think we have ISSS wanting to give Professor TJ a souvenir as a token of their appreciation. Oh, Anna Library. Sorry, my bad.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you. This is the story of my life by Helen Keller, and is truly a book which I will like very much. Thank you. No, this I haven't. Other things, yes, but not this.
Thank you, everyone.
That's it.
Yeah.
We have a vote of thanks, just a short one. Call upon Jayaraman to give vote of thanks. He's trying to run away. Not allowing.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. Okay. Thank you everyone for actively participating in this session today. And especially Professor T. Jayaraman for his well articulated speech and delivery. It was thank you, sir, for I attended your last speech about the COP28, and no, nothing has changed much. But what the key takeaway points from his speech is, I think, is like India has to emit more. And
not in that sense, but
I know. Just to, and the main point, I used to think what these people are doing at the COP, we are not seeing any much changes. But what I learned from his, from his slides, the common but differentiated responsibilities and the respective capabilities. I think that's the main important thing. People like you should continue to fight for. And so I hope this session was very much useful for everyone here. And once again, thank you, sir. And thank you, Anna Library, as always, for arranging this, giving all equipments and giving all the spaces here. And thank you, especially Siva Perumal, sir, for giving this opportunity. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.